All right, so today's topic is notes from the journalism diaspora, which I guess in comparison to some of the other talks sounds bleak. But really what we're here to talk about is the experience that we've had working on some shows that sort of take journalism and put it in new directions and employ journalists in new kind of jobs, but often relying on the skills that they've had for quite some time. But as a part of that discussion, looking at the fact that this is sort of a burgeoning field and that there's so many places right now where you could do this type of work, but also create it on your own, whatever company that you're at or individually. One of the things we're going to talk about here is the fact that this isn't just about distribution and the opportunity that's there from all the different places you can deliver stuff to people, but also about the storytelling opportunities that are there as well. So first, for the housekeeping, here are our Twitter handles. Please be kind to us on the Twitters, as well as I feel like I keep needing to adjust this, as well as the hashtag for today, ONA career paths. That I feel like we're going to need to coach people with a hashtag like that. So anyways, my name's Justin Ellis, and I am a researcher on Wyatt Cenac's Problem Areas. It's a show on HBO. We just had our first season conclude in June. Just out of curiosity, how many folks know about the show, have seen the show? That's good, that's good. The rest of you, please steal someone's HBO Go password immediately.
My name is Claire Gordon, and I'm the showrunner and executive producer of Explained on Netflix, which is a Vox Media production and was kind of an outgrowth of Vox's YouTube channel and YouTube Explainers, and it was their first foray into television. And if you guys haven't seen the show, it's 15-minute episodes, or it was meant to be 15-minute episodes, but we took some liberties and probably averages at 18. And each topic explains a different political, social, cultural issue. And previously, I was a senior producer at Last Week Tonight with John Oliver for 2 years. And yeah, for Explained was very much like a new kind of show for Netflix, and obviously a first-time thing for Vox. And they wanted to create a TV journalistic product that was different than the stuff you would see on TV and different from cable news, and they weren't entirely sure what that would look like, and so they specifically went and tried to recruit from the late night comedy space. And we can get into more of this later, but just there hasn't been a lot of innovation in TV journalism storytelling in a mainstream way for a very long time, and so they're like, well, comedy is one of the main ways that TV journalism has actually been innovated in the last generation. And so pulled me from the world of comedy to make they're like, do something creative and interesting and new, but without jokes. And so that's what we were trying to do with Explained on Netflix.
Yeah, and we were talking about this earlier. One of the things I think that all of us have seen right now is that there has been such an explosion in opportunities to deliver news and information in different ways. That's been obviously the story of journalism the last decade, sort of putting our stories sort of off-world, whether that's on Facebook and Twitter, whether it's Snapchat, Tumblr. Is Tumblr going to have its renaissance? Is anyone with me on that? No? No one in the room? Wow. R.I.P. Tumblr. But the story that's, I think, more interesting to me, and one of the reasons I wanted to do this panel, is the fact that it seems like there's also at the same time been this growing appetite for nonfiction content. And I apologize for using that word, but it feels like it's applicable because, whether you're talking about a show like Last Week Tonight, which is sort of the spiritual cousin to Problem Areas, or Full Frontal with Sam B, or if you're talking about Explained, or if you're talking about shows like Slate's Slow Burn, obviously Serial was one of the big stories. They all do things that I think many of us would say, well, that looks a lot like journalism, right? And I think that's one of the big stories for the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's become abundantly clear as this is obviously our industry goes through lots of changes and lots of stresses, is that the appetite is obviously there, and we both now work in television. And the one thing that gives me some comfort and some sense of like job security is that Americans love television. Like Americans will always watch television, and it might not be on TV sets, it might be on the internet or on a hologram, but like Americans love watching hours and hours of TV, and Americans also love high quality journalism. And I think that's become abundantly clear if you look at platforms like Netflix and like HBO, just the hunger for, I think we're in a golden era of like prestige documentary series and like documentary miniseries, particularly in the world of crime right now. But there's like a real desire for investigative quality work. There's just been a complete breakdown, disruption, in distribution platforms. So for TV news, I'd say in the last generation, you've had two really big innovations. One was cable news, which introduced the world to the idea of 24/7 news. And that created lots of amazing opportunities for journalism and storytelling, and I think totally reshaped not only the media landscape, but our politics and the way people like engage and understand the world around them, having 24/7 news. It also comes with lots of problems and pitfalls, one of them being that it's really expensive to program 24/7, and there isn't actually quality news you can deliver 24/7, so you end up filling hours and hours and hours with people talking, which is cheap, but it's also opinions, and you end up with a kind of a toxic news programming that isn't actually educating people, it's just angering them. So you've had cable news. And then the second great innovation of the last generation, I would say, was The Daily Show. And the entire genre of like pointed political satire that followed it, from like Last Week Tonight to Problem Areas to Sam B to The Opposition with Jordan Klepper, all these shows. And they weren't just satirizing politics, they were satirizing cable news. They were like satirizing the TV media landscape that they recognized was ridiculous that we were living in. And so Fox News and The Daily Show were both created in 1996. And 22 years later, you have this entire new genre of like smart, sharp, political, satirical programming. And that's like got a huge young audience. And then you have cable news, which has clearly never been more powerful. I mean, it elected our president's a reality star who knows how to play to like the cable news cycle. At the same time, you've had young people cord cutting. Young people are not going home at the end of the day and turning on the TV and falling asleep in front of it. Or they are, but it's their laptop on their stomach as they fall asleep.
They've probably stolen the password from their parents to get access to that.
Right. So you have older people watching cable news, but older people are still very powerful and run things. And then you have young people that are, primarily if they're watching TV journalism, it's in the form of comedy. And I think that clearly there's tons of space to produce something else that doesn't look like cable news in all the ways it's toxic, and also can reach a younger audience, but doesn't necessarily use it with like your anchors or comedians, and your vehicle is jokes. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think that one of the biggest movers there is that it's about the story. You know, like how many people here have some favorite true crime podcast, documentary show? Just out of curiosity, somebody name one. What is your favorite true crime podcast, TV show? Remember, there's things in this bag. Who said In the Dark? Terrific. Congratulations. You get the first prize. And now comes the scary part. Here we go.
Oh! Hoppa!
All right. This is going to be a lot more dangerous than I thought. All right, so it's good. Everybody stays on their toes. Yeah, so all these things, what they have in common is it's about story, right? And oftentimes, like, there's stories that we have all seen, whether in their local papers, whether in local TV stations, but they're drawn out, like you're saying, in these ways where they're turned into prestige, right? Where it becomes episodic, where it becomes this thing that people have to keep watching. And so you sort of take the trappings of like a mini series or sort of a TV drama, but you apply it to something like a murder in a small town, or one of the podcasts that I listen to, APM. It's called In the Dark, obviously. But the first one that they did was sort of, it hit home for me because it was about this case, Jacob Wetterling, this kid who disappeared in Minnesota, and it happened when I was growing up, and it was captivating because, again, it felt like you had to keep listening, similar to Serial. Sadly, though, for In the Dark, their first season was ruined because once they started off on the show, the cops were picking up on the clues, and they arrested the guy who was responsible for the crime. So moving from sort of where things are to sort of the shows that we're on, Claire, maybe you could explain a little bit more about explained, I guess, how you got there and how you sort of went from Last Week Tonight, your other jobs, and ended up being a showrunner, and maybe also it would be helpful for folks to understand about what a showrunner does.
Sure. So, like I said, like I was recruited because I was working in the late night comedy space, and Ezra Klein and Joe Posner, who runs Fox Video, who were like looking to find a showrunner because they had an idea of the kind of show they wanted, but they had no experience in television, and so wanted to find someone to run the show. And they very explicitly, and in fact, this was like in my first interview with Ezra, he was like, so TV news is broken. Cable news is a toxic nightmare. We want to make something that's innovative and different, but not using jokes like a Last Week Tonight. What would that look like? And it was like in an interview, and I was like, how would I reinvent TV news? And he was like, yeah. And I'm like, can I like get back to you about that over email maybe? But they very explicitly wanted to create a new kind of TV journalism, one that would reach a younger audience that wasn't watching cable news, one that really respected the intelligence of the audience, that, assuming your audience is just as smart as you are, but also assuming they have no knowledge, is sort of like our philosophical approach to making the show. And also being on Netflix was this crazy opportunity because almost every media platform is in some way like politically stratified, and Netflix and all these other entertainment streaming platforms are just this virgin territory for journalism with an audience that is not only like across the political spectrum, like no one signs up for Netflix, no one watches Stranger Things because they're a liberal or conservative. These are just this like untapped broad audience that's not only in the US but global, and that spans age groups. And I think there's been some hesitancy on the part of these platforms to get into the journalism game because journalism doesn't have the best rap right now. And I think these platforms have done such a good job in cultivating such a big and broad audience that they're nervous about alienating any group if they were to become seen as a news provider. But I think you're seeing that shift, and these platforms are starting to experiment with more current affairs style programming. So for me, this just felt like a crazy opportunity that they were like, hey, want to come and try and reinvent what TV news can be and be the first current affairs show on a streaming platform to reach this kind of audience for the first time? And I'm like, you don't know how not qualified I am to do that because you've never made a television show before. But I will take advantage of your ignorance and say yes to this job.
That's a key takeaway here. Definitely take advantage of someone else's ignorance when you're trying to get a job.
Yeah,
I've
never been qualified for any job I've ever had. But particularly in television, you end up having to learn pretty quickly. So that's how I ended up at Explained. How I ended up at Last Week Tonight was even luckier. I was working at Al Jazeera America, the sort of like short-lived TV news network that was like an expansion of like the Al Jazeera empire. They launched an Al Jazeera America specific network. And I got a job there because I had originally been a digital journalist. I was like working for, it was my first job out of college. I was working for AOL editorial sites, writing print. And I loved the craft, but I slowly realized I didn't necessarily have the temperament to do that because I got lonely. And the idea of just staring at my computer screen all day and like making a handful of phone calls, but basically being alone and working alone and my product being alone, I was like, I don't know if I have just the personality traits to have this kind of like everyday life of sort of like lonely work. But I love journalism, and so I wanted to see what TV was like, and because I thought it seemed really collaborative. And so got a job at Al Jazeera America as a digital associate producer, and at our flagship show called America Tonight, which was an incredible experience and opportunity because it was all these veteran like TV journalists from CNN and the networks making the show, and they were all like really cynical about the state of TV news, and they wanted to make like the like TV news show that they like always wish they could make, and like cover all these underreported stories and do all this in-depth stuff. And as like a young like cub reporter there who knew nothing about TV, like I learned the ropes, and it was like this old school kind of newsroom that I don't think really exists in TV anymore. The one problem with that is there's a reason it doesn't exist anymore, which is that like no one really wants to watch it. So we made what I think is a really great show, and Al Jazeera had like various other problems with why people weren't watching it, starting with the name Al Jazeera, which is a hard sell in the US. But I really loved making television, but was discouraged that people weren't really watching, but also like no one in my age group was watching. Like no one in my age group, and we didn't have any online presence. It was part of our deal with the cable carriers. As a young startup network, the cable carriers were like, we don't want to compete against ourselves for free online, so we basically will ban you from putting stuff online. So we had no online presence really, and my friends like didn't watch TV news. And it feels like you're in La La Land when you spend every day like creating a news product, and no one you know has ever seen it or can really see it, and a lot of my friends didn't even own televisions. And I was home watching Last Week Tonight one day, and I was like literally watching it, and I'm like, this is the kind of show I want to work on, where you're getting to tell journalistic stories, but actually reach people, and people I know it, and watch it, and I can feel and see its impact in just my own peer group. So I Googled Last Week Tonight jobs. They don't have a job website, but an article came up about how when Last Week Tonight was originally staffing up, they wanted to try to get more women into the applicant pool because late night comedy is traditionally very male heavy, and how the showrunner of Last Week Tonight had enlisted his friend Nell Scoville, who's sort of like a legendary woman in TV comedy, to recommend folks and bring more women into the applicant pool. So I just cold Facebook message this like legendary lady, Nell Scoville, like cold Facebook message. Never done that in my life before. I'm like not that kind of ballsy a person. But I just send her a Facebook message about how I love the show and blah, 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 and if she could maybe connect me to someone who I could try to persuade to like beg for an opportunity to try to apply for a job, I'd be so grateful. And she responds immediately, thanks for your message. Like, I'm really busy right now. Please give me a week to reply. So a week passes. She doesn't reply. So I send a follow-up. And then another week passes, and she doesn't reply. So I send another follow-up. And another week passes, and I say to my roommate, like, that sucks that this thing with Nell Scoville that was never going to be a thing turned out not to be a thing. And my roommate, who's a lot ballsier than I am, is like, no, you should send an email like every week, like forever. Like, what do you have to lose?
You have a lot to lose.
I had a lot to lose. I had some dignity left. But I send like one more message. And then I get a phone call later that day, and she's like, hi, it's Nell Scoville. And then she just straight up grills me for an hour. Like, what'd you major in college? Did you write a thesis? Did you like writing your thesis? And then finally, at the end of that phone call, she's like, "Your timing's really crazy. I just learned today that for the first time, a creative position on the show's opened up, and I'd love to put your name forward to get a chance to submit what they call like a packet to the show." So she does that. I'm told I have 48 hours to submit this packet based on a prompt. A day after that, they're like,
Hold on just one second. For folks, maybe we should explain like what the packet and what the prompt is in this case, like what those things are.
Sure. So I was submitting to be a producer on the show. And so the prompt was, imagine we're doing one of our long segments on the minimum wage. Create a packet about what you think that would look like and the clips you would use and the points you would make, and basically like do a kind of a rough sort of research, clips, what this story would look like. So I don't sleep very much, churn out this thing in a fever craze. The next day, I'm asked if I can go to New York. The following day, I was living in DC, to go to an interview, which I assumed would be like a first round interview. And my only like interview outfit at that time was like basically like polyester and like a long sleeve, and it was August, and I like got off on the wrong subway stop, so I just remember like running and like sweating and full on like polyester. And I get there, and I'm like brought into a room with like John Oliver and the showrunner and the co-exec, feeling like very sweaty, and I'm pretty sure that I bombed the interview because it lasts 10 minutes. And at that point at Al Jazeera, I was primarily doing investigative work on campus sexual assault. So my entire resume was like just all my campus sexual assault, like investigative work. And John Oliver asked the question, he's like, "So, do you care about anything other than rape?" And I'm like, "Oh, you know your interview isn't going well when John Oliver asks you if you care about anything other than rape." And then in my head, I'm like, think, like, what's the opposite of rape? To seem like a balanced person, seem like I have like diverse interests, like what would be the opposite of rape be? And so I just blurt out, like the financial industry. And he's like, really, the financial industry? I'm like, yeah, just like financial issues and rape are my two main interests.
This is the weirdest interview I've ever heard of.
Lasted 10 minutes, and then I leave. And later that day, or like I think like an hour later, I got a call saying I got the job. And I'm like so stunned, and I call Nell Scoville, and I was like, "Nell, like," and this was like a week after I'd talked to her on the phone, or less than, and I was like, "Nell, like I got the job," and she's like, "You're kidding me."
That's a vote of confidence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my story is similar, but not in the same way that I had a previous life in journalism. Prior to working at Problem Areas, I was an editor at ESPN. I was editing stories for their magazine as well as the website, and also hosting a podcast for a brief period of time. And prior to that, I was a writer at the Neiman Journalism Lab for a number of years, writing about the future of journalism. Turns out there's a lot of chaos in the future of journalism. And so when I was at ESPN, I had been there for 2 years, and at that point, things were going okay. And out of nowhere, I get this email from an assistant to one of the producers that says, "Hey, we're putting together this new show. It's from Wyatt Cenac, and your name was recommended to us." And I go, "Oh, okay." Turns out that I know someone that knows Wyatt Cenac, and she's sitting right there, actually. It's LaToya. And it's a very similar story because I was like, "Oh, okay, what does this mean?" They're like, "Well, we're putting together this show. We're looking for some journalists who can be researchers on our staff. We're doing something that's going to be similar to John Oliver's show. We want to have researchers who can sort of create an underpinning of knowledge and background research before we delve into topics." And I'm like, "Okay, sure, why not? I don't know what this is, but take an interview." So I have a call with the executive producer. I don't really remember what we talk about, but we spend at least 5 minutes talking about how bad Boston is because she grew up there. And but somehow she's like, "You seem like you might be a good fit. You sound like you've been doing some good stuff at ESPN. Would you mind coming in for an interview on Monday? You know, I talked to them on Friday. They first contacted me on a Wednesday. So I go in, I have an interview on Monday. I meet with Wyatt and our head writer, a woman who was a writer at The Daily Show. And it's also a very circuitous interview process because somehow we go from talking about, you know, what my research background is, what are some stories that I've worked on, to things like, is Elon Musk Tony Stark or is he Dr. Doom? This is a very Wyatt conversation, I would later learn. Also, randomly, we were talking about Goop. I don't know if that was something that put me over the edge in terms of getting the job, but I left after like 90 minutes thinking that was very strange, but, you know, I'm going to go back to ESPN. And within 2 days, they call me back and say, so we'd like to offer you a job, and we need you to start within the next week because this show is off and running, and we're going to be starting up very soon. So fortunately, ESPN was kind enough to let me leave quickly, and so I started with this show, and it was a process that we could talk about a little bit, but it was a first-year show. The idea was that with Last Week Tonight, they spend 30 minutes each week on one topic. But with Problem Areas, the idea that Wyatt and the executive team had come up with was that instead of spending 30 minutes on one topic each week, we would spend an entire season on one topic, but then take each 30-minute episode and drill down into the very specific issues in it. And the first season was about policing in America. That's not a complicated topic at all. That was the joke, folks. So we can talk a little bit about how the show came together, but first I think it probably would be helpful to show a clip. So just, what did I do there? Nope. Oh, God. How do you stop this crazy thing? This is very awkward. Why is this not? Nope. Why did I switch screens? Oh, dear.
While you do that, I could explain. I
Yes,
realized I
that would
didn't
be
answer
great.
what a showrunner does. So a showrunner is a term that basically was created because originally the top editorial person at a show was the executive producer, but then the term executive producer in TV and film became essentially meaningless because it became used to describe folks that just like gave a bunch of money, it was like became kind of like just a prestige, meaningless title. You would go on and be kind of like an honorary executive producer, which would lend like some sort of like cachet to your show. And so they decided they needed to come up with a new term to describe the person that actually runs a show. And so they came up with showrunner. And the showrunner is basically the person that is in charge of the staff and the budget, making sure everything runs smoothly, but is also the head creative. So you are signing off on all the scripts, signing off on just like the creative content of the show. So it's a tricky job because you find yourself moving between. You spend most of your time in a creative headspace, and then you have to like look at spreadsheets. And parts of that job I was definitely not at all experienced in, and I learned that the key to that is just to hire good people and then get it out of their way, which is what I did.
All right, well, my shame and embarrassment is now over. Let's take a look at a clip from the show real quick.
Community policing, also known as neighborhood policing, is when police try to get to know the people living in the communities they patrol. A lot of times it gets brought up when a police department is looking to rebuild its image following a tragic scandal. Like in Ferguson, Missouri, when after one of their police officers shot and killed Michael Brown in 2014, the community demanded change.
The Ferguson Police Department is putting its new neighborhood policing program to work.
The program is designed to get officers out to specific neighborhoods and work with community members to help build stronger relationships and businesses. The chief says it's the beginning of a positive move towards healing after months of unrest left a scar on the community.
Community-oriented policing, which is a form of policing that puts police officers in the community as problem solvers and not as an occupying force.
It means we have to create a sense of ownership on both sides. They have to create the idea that the police belong to the community and that the community is there to look out for their police officers who are protecting them.
For a second, it seemed like he was gonna say, and the community belonged to the police, which he didn't, and he covered it smoothly. But when a police department uses the community as a prop to make itself look good, it can sort of feel that way. Like this attempt at community policing in Wichita.
Wichita police officer is now you see him right there, a viral sensation. A video of him already has more than 3 million views.
Officer Aaron Moses knows how to bust a move.
I hit the whip in the nay-nay. I got some lessons on that. Someone approached me last night and told me I'm Officer Brown with the get down.
Just because a cop has a badge doesn't mean they get to invite themselves to someone's cookout and show off that they know how to do the whip and the nay-nay. Also, what the fuck was he there to investigate? A missing potato salad? And look, that was an impromptu effort at community engagement, but some departments like this one in Mount Vernon, New York, they put a lot more resources into letting the community know that cops are human too.
I've been watching.
Okay, I think you get the idea. No. So with our show, like I was saying, the idea was that we were going to take 30 minutes each week and break down a social issue, a community issue, larger issues in America. And with policing in America, the idea was, well, how do we tell this story each week? What's the staff that we need to do this each week? And first off, John Oliver is one of the executive producers, and one of our other executive producers came over from the show. They wanted to have researchers on hand. All the research staff are actually people who come from journalism backgrounds. And so in the first season, we had researchers such as myself coming from ESPN, another one from The Guardian, another one from The New Yorker. And going into that, I had never worked in TV before, but the idea was that, well, before we go out and do any stories, before we go out into the field, before we try to figure out how to tell a story about policing in America and also try to be funny, we need to actually know stories about policing in America. And so what that meant for the researchers is that, honestly, we ended up doing a lot of the stuff that we had become well acquainted with in our jobs as journalists. We're chasing down primary documents to learn a little bit more about court cases. We are looking up financial documents. We're looking up things around different political activity. And, we're spending time looking at other stories from local news organizations, but then sort of re-reporting them to do some stress testing to see if, things have changed on the ground. And the thing where this all sort of shifts from just doing the typical work that journalists are used to is when we take that and then we work sort of hand in hand with the writers to actually craft the story, because they're the ones who are working with Wyatt to sort of figure out what's going to be the most interesting way to approach this in a kind of a documentary way, but also how do we do this in a way that is potentially humorous, which, as it turns out, is not a very easy thing to do. So for 10 episodes, each of the researchers would basically work with a team of writers on one of the, we called them the C block, which this is sort of the beginning of each story. Each episode, I should say, has a top of the show. Each episode has the top of the show as well as sort of an interstitial element, and then the chunk of it is these C blocks, these sort of documentary portions. They often involve when Wyatt goes to a different community, learning about some issue, interviewing people. One of the challenges, because this was a first season show that we had not expected, is that when you are calling up people to sort of do pre-interviews, they're not really sure what it is that you're doing. And when you say that, well, I'm doing this HBO late night show, it's sort of documentary, our host used to be on The Daily Show, a lot of times they're going to say, no, we will not talk to you, because they're used to what The Daily Show's done. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we're not attempting to do things as satire. We're not attempting to do things in a way where the people themselves are the punchline, but more instead that we are trying to go out into the field and gain some understanding from Wyatt visiting people. I could just push this ahead for just a few minutes. So this story is about a town in Illinois, and it was a story that we were going to do about community policing. It was an interesting program where cops in this town called Elgin live in the community that they're supposed to be patrolling. So cops actually get a rent-free house in a neighborhood. They're encouraged to basically get to know their neighbors, patrol around. People are there's a big sign that says this is, a cop lives here. And, we went there basically to learn about this program, learn about the history of it. It's been around for over 20 years because they touted as sort of a way to have better connections between police and the community. If you're actually there face-to-face getting to know people, you might have better results. That was the first part of the story, though. The second part of the story, after we had gone out in the field, shot this, and then came back, was that months later, after we had gone and come back, there was a police shooting. And it was a police shooting that took place on the highway. It was publicized in all the local media. The cops had cornered this woman who was having some sort of episode, perhaps some sort of psychotic episode. She had trapped herself in her car. She had a knife, and the police cornered her, were trying to get her out of the car, and they ended up shooting her. And the thing that made the whole incident more harrowing was the fact that everything was caught on body cameras, because that's the way so many things are caught now. And so the question that we had to deal with was, okay, we went in doing this story about community policing and trying to see what the effect of one program is. And now we kind of have to switch into a mode that, again, is something that's a lot like what journalists are used to doing, which is reacting to some news, trying to put some context around it and putting it into this bigger story. And so, for me, what that meant was on the earlier side of this, we're doing research to find out about the community, about the program, to see what the criticisms of it are, who the people that would be good to talk to in a community are. But once the story switched gears, then I'm basically doing what I've done in the past as a journalist, which is talking to the victim's family, talking to the police officers, talking to the organization that's investigating the shooting. And from there, then the question that we have to figure out to sort of finish the episode is, what do you do when you're expecting to do this story that kind of looks at a community issue, but all of a sudden has this unknown element to it, right? Where the shooting happened, we were going to be airing the episode within a matter of weeks, and had to figure out, well, how do we end this? And without giving too much away, because hopefully everyone will still watch, we kind of had to resolve it with, well, this is what's happening right now, and it's sort of an ongoing story that's happening in America. So that's sort of my experience with working on problem areas. I will say that some of the things that I was not expecting, again, going into this show, not having TV experience, is that the job did call for things that I was used to. They are often looking for how to track down individuals. So that means, we're going and running things through on LexisNexis, right? Oftentimes, it also meant, though, that we were doing fact-checking on scripts, right? And that's something that I sort of used to from being an editor, but at the same time, though, I have not a lot of experience of looking at TV scripts and what things are useful and what things aren't. I also don't have much experience with watching footage and figuring out sort of what things are permissible by most TV standards and what things we had to figure out on our own as a show. And that was actually one of the things that was most exciting about jumping on to the show, was that being a first-year program, there was so much that we didn't know, and we had to create basically on the fly. We did, to give a little bit of an inside story, but we did 3 test shows before we aired in the spring, and each one of them changed. Things changed from one to another, and each time you have to sort of figure out what works, what doesn't, and then adjust your processes to that. And all of that, even though it was harrowing at times, it was also very, very exciting. Let's take a look at a clip from Explain real quick.
Yeah, or I think I wanted to, all the stuff you're saying was really interesting, and just reminded me with Last Week Tonight how Last Week Tonight, I feel there was definitely an evolution in how it embraced, or its relationship to journalism, that I think that Problem Areas took sort of the best learnings from, because Last Week Tonight, as kind of a spin-off from The Daily Show, it took kind of the model of The Daily Show, which is we had one researcher on staff. a hero, this guy, Chuck Wilson, who was a fact checker at like New York Times Magazine, and it was just him. And it became pretty clear that producing the show that we were producing with these like 20-minute long, in-depth explanations of often really thorny topics, that one dude couldn't just like, the entire journalism and like integrity of the journalism of the show couldn't rest on one dude's shoulders. And today, the research staff at Last Week Tonight is 4 senior researchers, 2 who were like journalists poached from ProPublica, a junior researcher, and 4 assistant researchers. And like the journalistic operation of Last Week Tonight is like really rigorous. Like these are people that are, you know, working till 10 p.m., often midnight, the couple days before we go to air. And it's been like really, or it was really interesting at Last Week Tonight seeing how, as like journalistic principles and journalistic practices became a bigger and bigger part of the show staff and the show process, but also there's like comedy principles and practices that in a way are sort of similar in a different language to a lot of journalistic ones. Like there's like a comedy principle, which is you don't punch down. Like you don't make fun of someone that's like basically not a public figure. You don't like some random person on the street, if there's like a video clip of like someone being like silly in some way, but they're just like a random citizen, you don't play that clip and make fun of them because that's punching down. So it was like really interesting to see comedy principles and journalistic principles sort of like merge, and then also folks like John Oliver and our showrunner who didn't have a journalism background, they had a comedy background, sort of like just like stumbling on journalistic principles just with a good sense of, just coming from a good sense of like story and ethics. So there was one segment I produced about vaccines and like the anti-vaccine movement, and I don't know if folks in your room have worked on stories about the anti-vaccine movement, but it is like crazy making if you spend time on the internet, like watching anti-vax documentaries, watching anti-vax videos, like you suddenly start having conspiracy thinking and like going down rabbit holes and like ultimately end up in the place that like, yeah, like there are really rare, like 1 in a million cases where the kids have an allergic reaction to vaccines and can end up like really badly harmed by that. And mothers are understandably really distraught over it and feel the media isn't covering it, or there's some conspiracy of silence about it. And so there's an impulse to be like, we should give voice to these people and at least acknowledge that these people exist. I remember in a story meeting with John and our showrunner, them just both saying, it's like, well, if we show a clip of a mother distraught over their kid who was harmed by a vaccine, like that will suck all the oxygen out of the room. Like a mother crying about their kid, like that is the one thing people will remember when they finish watching this episode. And because these reactions are 1 in a million, it is reckless for us as storytellers to spend 30 seconds talking about that. It would make sense if our segment was 500,000 minutes, that would be proportional. But it's just irresponsible to make that a message that will stay with people. It's like irresponsible.
That's interesting because we had a similar thing. This episode that I was just talking about, again, because these are stories that are happening so often in America now, when you have the footage, you have body cam footage of someone being shot, the question often is how do you use that? And if you use it, in what capacity? And that, again, that's a normal thing that happens in a newsroom, but when you're working on a late night comedy show, it's a similar question of, is it responsible to use this? Is this going to, would it be wrong for us to use this if we're also in the same hour, in the same half hour making jokes about things? And we ultimately ended up using it, but cutting it in a way where we felt like you understood what happened for the necessity of the story, but not in any way where it becomes sort of this defining element of it. And the other thing that I will say really quickly is that I think that one of the things that's interesting about these processes is because our show, similar to Explain, similar to Last Week Tonight, other places, you've got people coming from so many different backgrounds, whether it's comedy, whether it's news, people coming from documentary, that they each bring different skill sets with them, but they also bring different storytelling perspectives. And so when you're looking at how do we actually tell stories about policing in America, I think the thing that we ended up getting to was the fact that if you use some of the principles in comedy about making things absurd and escalating them to a point where you have no choice but to laugh about them or make fun of them, that also gives you leeway to sort of look into them, explore them a little bit deeper. Because if you basically, you know, as Wyatt did so many times over the course of the season, if you basically get it to a point where you could just have to say, what the fuck, then you can actually get people to sort of take a look at something a little bit deeper. And real quickly, let's just take a look at a clip from Explain.
Sure, yep.
Married, but over 800,000 called it quits. Our quest for and failure at monogamy has caused so much pain and heartbreak. If it's so hard for humans to be monogamous, why do most of us all around the world make it one of the most central goals of our lives?
I start asking myself, is he right for me?
Belgium, King Baudouin married Donna Fabiola. I'm
a very lucky man.
A beautiful shot of the new royal couple.
Wonderful anniversary shot.
The Prince of Wales has admitted publicly that he was unfaithful.
Announcing my resignation.
The crime was to have conceived a child with a married neighbor.
Nelson Mandela.
A broken marriage.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
If you ask couples why they chose monogamy, you'll hear one answer again and again. They fell in love.
We met in a candy store, 1946.
We went to college together.
We were both in a relationship then. We didn't cheat.
I look so guilty every time we talk about it.
I'm bad at talking about this.
It's arranged marriage. Whatever they selected for me, it was good. And I'm very happy with that.
We had a study date one night, and that study break turned into anatomy, I guess.
I've never felt this way about anybody before.
I feel God has blessed us.
Yeah, so I just wanted to show that as so this was our first episode of Explained. Monogamy was episode number 1. And unlike Last Week Tonight and Problem Areas, I think we're more, in a clearer way, we're a journalistic operation with journalistic practices. I think the challenges and opportunities and new constraints that we had were the fact that we were, A, creating a product for a global audience, and B, that our just vision for the show was taking like big cultural, political, or social topics and explaining them. So our first episode was monogamy, and explaining monogamy in 15 minutes to the world raises some thorny editorial questions, because every country, culture, and religion has very strong feelings about monogamy, and we only had 15 minutes. And so explaining this topic in a way that we felt in at least a surface way was nodding to and acknowledging and representing sort of like major worlds of opinion and experiences around monogamy was really important, but also we didn't have a crazy budget to fly around the world and interview people in every country, culture, and religion about monogamy. And even when it comes to religion, and I don't think we did a perfect job, and going back and watching that episode, there are a lot of things that I wish we'd done differently, and this was our first episode. And one of those things was that we didn't actually really address religion at all. And we got a lot of sort of like negative feedback about that from people that were religious, saying like, how in explaining monogamy could you not talk about how like religion, like my religion is like the reason why monogamy is important to me. It's like the sanctity of monogamy is core to the way I view the world and my faith. And part of the reason that we didn't delve into that is because if you're going to talk about religion and monogamy have a really complicated relationship, and it depends on the religion, and it depends on what period of time, and not all religions and factions of religions at different periods of time have espoused monogamy or espoused it, or it's been espoused for different reasons. So that was just like so doing Explained has just raised new kind of unique editorial challenges by just the nature of what we were setting out to do and reaching a global audience. Like, and obviously if you produce anything online, you reach, in theory, a global audience, but this was like explicitly this is being translated into 29 languages. A lot of them are going to be like dubbed. The narrator is going to be speaking Mandarin or Spanish. It's going to be like going out to the audience and like marketed to them as like a product that feels native to them. So telling a story, even just like putting in phrases, going through the script and adding phrases like in the West, and like when you're telling a story and making it American-centric or focused on the Western Hemisphere, like acknowledging that very explicitly and like thinking, and always thinking in my head, like what would a 15-year-old Indian kid think watching this, and have we given them the context they need to follow it, which comes down to the assuming that your audience is as smart as you are, but have no information. So that's been sort of like the unique editorial challenge of working on Explained. And I would say at Last Week Tonight, where the relationship with journalism is like a little bit more complicated, and I know a lot of people would say, or there was like a trend of people talking about with The Daily Show, that it was like where they mainly got their news. And I know that Jon Stewart always was really resistant to identifying his show as journalistic, and John Oliver similarly. And I think part of that is because of the constraints of the format of what that they're doing, and fundamentally, they're a comedy show. If people are not laughing at that show, the show will be canceled. And because of that, like Last Week Tonight always started with like a quick recap of the week. And if it was a normal weekly news show, you would just pick the 3 most important stories that happened in the world that week. But we weren't a normal news show. We were a comedy show. So the quick recap of the week, one of those stories might be like the leader of Chechnya losing his cat and complaining about it on Instagram. That is not one of the most important things that has happened in any week, but it's really funny. So we would make that the top billing on the show. And because Last Week Tonight, like a lot of like problem areas and a lot of shows in that genre rely on clips, the entire format of the show is like person at desk, playing clip, responding to clip. And because of that, at Last Week Tonight, we really wanted to cover stories that were underreported or not getting a lot of mainstream media attention, but it had to have had some attention because there needed to be clips that we could use to structure the show. And so there were certain topics that we were really interested in covering, but because there hadn't been like news coverage of it or documentaries on it, we just didn't have the raw material we needed to do it. So like one of those was about legacy admissions. And we wanted to do like a 20-minute piece about legacy admissions being nonsense. And there just wasn't the video clips to base a segment like that on, just because no one who's gotten into college based on legacy is like out doing TV interviews about it. So there are just certain constraints by the format that mean that we can't do what a standard TV news show can do by going out and just getting their own material and doing all their own interviews, just because of the format that we've set up for ourselves and that viewers expect.
We should take some questions, but I think just lastly, I guess a couple of things that we wanted to say about lessons, even though we've talked about a number of things, but one for me is that I think as journalists move into different jobs and different areas, whether it is within the industry or elsewhere, it's important to know that all of us have more skills than we probably give ourselves credit for, because of the many things that journalists have to do on a day-to-day basis, not just what we think of as the tasks of reporting and editing and writing. It's the fact that we know how to find information in very fast and effective ways. We know how to parse, hopefully, what are good facts and good data versus what is not. We know how to hopefully get people to open up to us. And these are all really good, marketable, useful skills that can find a home in doing other kind of creative pursuits outside of newsrooms, or perhaps creating new types of products like these within newsrooms, where we need to think about ways of delivering news and information differently than how we already have.
Yep. And writing quickly and clearly is just like, that is the skill that I thank my lucky stars that I started my career writing 3 articles a day for like several years. But yeah, I think that at my show Explained and at Last Week Tonight, I said this before, I really think that every job I've had, I've been thoroughly unqualified to do and had to learn very quickly how to do it. And all of that has been manageable. A lot of the skills involved in producing television, you have to learn on the fly, and you learn by being dropped in the deep end. But the thing that I think is the hardest to learn, and I'm again so grateful that I started my career doing this, is like just like journalistic principles and practices, and just knowing what sources are credible, just the impulse of picking up the phone, and now like working at Vox, like a younger digital media outlet, and I think there's impulse just to find answers on the internet, and just like my impulse is to call someone. It is always faster to just call a person, and I think just like those impulses and those journalistic skills are the hardest to really get under your skin, and I'm like very grateful that I got them in my bones when I was young.
Wow, so there's a big bag here full of tiny bottles. Let's take some rapid fire questions, thoughts, please. There's this bag here that I'm going to end up having to pass out to people, so please. Questions, comments, observations, heckling, anything, guys? Hello? Hello? Yes, and there's microphones right here if you want to. Oh, sure, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I would, sure. She mentioned that I had described working as like a digital print reporter. I found it kind of lonely, and whether I'd found like the experience of TV more collaborative, and whether we'd both learned stuff from those collaborations. I would say definitely. TV is like so inherently collaborative just because your deadlines are crazy, and the quality of what you need to produce is so high that everyone needs to be in specialized roles. So as Explained, we have like professional editors, we have our professional camera people, we have professional animators, professional people that are used to working with the post house and deliverables, professional color person. We just have like a bunch of people in specialized roles, and everyone is so dependent on each other, and your deadlines are so nuts that there's a collaboration that's really intense and I find really rewarding, but it's definitely something that's hard to get used to if you don't come from that background. And so at Explained, I borrowed a lot of the really talented producers from Vox Video to come and produce episodes of the show. And Vox Video, like these kids are so talented. Like they pitch stories themselves, and once they're greenlit, they basically report them, produce them, animate them, and edit them, and then voice over them entirely themselves on deadlines that are flexible because they're publishing on YouTube. And so these are like triple threat, talented folks, but bringing them into a world where it's like you need to basically be a leader of a team, and you need to communicate what you want and have like the gentle touch that where you give feedback and on a really intense timeline where you're also inspiring people to like work really hard and articulating your vision. And that's a really hard thing to adjust to if you're used to working alone. Also, because if you work alone, you probably have like your own like little creepy habits of how you work, like writing little codes to yourself, like made up this fact, check it later, capital letters, and like do things last, which you should have done first, but it's fine because you're alone and so you can be creepy. And when you're working like collaboratively in a group, you have to like get rid of all your creepy habits and learn how to like communicate really clearly. And that's, I think when that gels right, when you have a team that works together right, that can be just really just
Get rid of all your creepy habits. That's one of the big takeaways from today. And just jumping on that really quickly, I would say that what I learned is that even though you do collaborate often in newsrooms, what is different when you are creating products from scratch like this is that the interdependency is a lot greater in the fact that if you can't deliver if you don't deliver something at one point, then someone else doesn't, and someone else doesn't. And obviously, again, these are things that happen in newsrooms all the time when you look at copy editors, photo, things like that. But there's elements of those that can be done at the same time. With TV, it's essentially that you have to pass one thing on to another person because your job is to make sure one part of this is clear. And so that was something that was new to me. Other questions?
She gets tequila.
Oh, other questions? I already threw it.
You did?
Yeah. Questions? Yes. I think the highest skill that I've learned in jumping onto this job is that you've got to be a lot more quick thinking and decision making. You know, when you like Claire said, you know, when you're doing things on your own, when you're reporting on your own, you can sometimes do them in your own time. But with this, you know, it's that we've got to do something in a set window of time. Like a shooting schedule is this many days, or, you know, we've got to deliver a script, you know, by this day so it can be checked by us, then checked by the legal department, things like that. And though, you know, so you have to make tough decisions on the fly in terms of who's going to be a good person to talk to, what's going to be a good place to go to potentially for a story. And again, that sounds kind of crazy, but those were the things that I think really gelled for me in this job. That's not that those weren't things that I had to do before. It's just that I think when you're working on a project that's sort of bigger than you, and it's also got somebody else's name on it, that it's like, okay, I've got to do this, and I've got to do it pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think similarly, mine would just be organizational skills, which are just tied into being collaborative and tied into the creepy habit thing. Like my habit of just emailing all notes to myself or saving them as drafts, and as that being the system for how I worked really well when I was just a reporter doing my own work by myself. But now, like managing a staff of 27, it's like I need to have a better system than just saved drafts of my thoughts.
Yes.
So both of you are given opportunities outside of your experience area industry, and so my question is, now that you are where you are, how much are you influencing the hiring people where you're at to give people a shot totally out of, like, if I send you a resume and I have legacy media experience, would you consider a position like that, or resume like that, or are you just saying, no, you're not, you don't have that experience, but are you influencing the people around you to give people shots like you've gotten, is my question.
Sure, that's a really good question. And I absolutely try to close the window and door behind me wherever I go. I feel like that's the best policy, and sort of bury the hole that I am in. No, I absolutely am. And the thing is, it was actually a good opportunity the first year of our show because things were happening. We were building the team as we were going along, and so often they were coming to people on staff asking, like, hey, do you know anybody that can do X, Y, and Z? And again, because I think coming from the world of journalism, you know, if you know somebody who is really good at cutting video, if you know someone, you know, like one of the jobs on our show that I wasn't aware of is we've got someone who's sort of an archivist. And that doesn't mean that they're archiving a show. It means that they're the person that has to go through and find clips of stuff, and they have to have kind of an encyclopedic knowledge of where to find things, various services like to use. And that's, you know, that is a job that is out there in TV, but it's also, I think, a job that a journalist would be, you know, pretty well suited for in terms of thinking about different stories, different platforms to do searching on for that. And so, absolutely, I mean, I think it's really important. Again, like also, you know, a lot of the people that I know are journalists in general. So when the time comes for hiring, I'm often thinking about that. Now, you know, do I have control over that? In my role, I do not. All I can do is advise and make suggestions, but I do think that it's absolutely important.
And I hired the staff for Explained, and we used a lot of Vox folks, but I hired about 23 people, and I think only 4 of them had worked in television before. So I think because I had the philosophy of I've always been dropped in the deep end at every job, so I'm just going to bring a bunch of other people in and drop them in the deep end.
It's great. Then you can all swim together. Ducks fly together, I think. The Mighty Ducks reference. Other questions? Other questions? We're running a little late, but let's try to get some, make it worthwhile for folks.
Hi, I'm Anu from Finland. I would like to ask about your programs. What kind of audience you have and what kind of feedback have you had? Like, have you really managed to find the new audience and the young ones? And do they like your programs?
Well, in our case, it's a little bit tough because HBO is a subscription service, and so the audience is definitely one question that we often have about how we're reaching people, and that's why we put a lot of our clips on other platforms. You know, we put them on YouTube. We try to make sure that people are aware of them. This was actually something that I felt like I probably maybe butted heads a little bit with people in the room because my feelings were like, well, we should just make them available. Why wouldn't we make them available? And then they're like, well, dummy, because we work for a subscription service and they also need to make money doing this, and that also helps you. And so in our case, it was about finding a balance. And with HBO, you know, yeah, they know that their subscribers are in a certain demographic. You know, you've got to be able to pay to get HBO. Obviously, it's not cheap. But they also know that people are also using HBO Go, HBO Now, the different versions of that. And so we kind of tried to balance out how we distributed it in terms of what audiences are out there and who's watching where. I think we definitely want to increase the younger demographic in our audience. And I think what we were trying to do in our second season is thinking about different ways that we make the show available. Yeah.
And I mean, Netflix pretty famously keeps their cards close to their chest when it comes to viewer numbers. And so I don't have a good understanding of the actual numbers there. I have heard, like, anecdotally folks say that their kids that are teens, like, watching our show. And for me, that's, like, the best thing anyone could say. If we can, like, reach teens that have just grown up watching, like, social video.
Cool teens.
Cool teens. You got to get the cool teens. The cool teens are the future. I unfortunately am not friends with lots of teens, so I don't have firsthand knowledge of how the teens are digging our show. But I have heard from folks that that teens are watching it and are talking about it as like, oh, there's like if you want to know about the world, like a way to like get some like in-depth like content, like the show explained on Netflix, and the fact that 15 minutes is long form and in-depth is one thing, but if you're a teen, that's the reality.
Maybe that is long form. All right, one more, and then we will let everyone get on with the rest of their day. Yes. Yeah, so the question was about the program Deezus and Miro and our thoughts on sort of the approach that they take to producing their show, the use of social media. I think it's a great show. I think it's amazing. I think they're both really talented, really funny guys, and I think that their success should not be a surprise to anyone because not only are they funny and they have great chemistry, but the approach that they're taking it's nuanced, but it's also simple in some ways. Like, you know, they get people in a room. They talk about things that are happening, but they're doing it in a way that feels more relevant because of the platforms that they're using and also just because of their personalities, you know? Like, I think that's, I don't want to make it boil, I don't want to seem like I'm boiling it down to that, but I think that those are some of the things that are really, really important to their success. I think that is repeatable in so much as you have to think about who the people are that are leading shows, you have to think about what the approach is. You know, I think they figured out very precisely sort of what they wanted their aesthetic to be, and you know, I think there's lessons for all of us in that, in thinking about how you target your show and how you best use the people who are in front of the camera.
And I think the internet in general has, and all these experiments in video storytelling that you've seen on YouTube, absolutely influence Explained. Like, Explained is a outgrowth of like the digitally native, like explainer video format. And I think one of the ways that that's most apparent is information density. I think that young people are used to consuming information at a faster pace and packed in, and there's a competition for attention. And I think that's just influenced like more stuff on screen, like shots changing more quickly, like information packed in, like layers that you could rewatch something a third time and catch something, and just like a density to storytelling, which I think if you watch 60 Minutes, I think a young person watching 60 Minutes would find it like remarkably like slow in the way it's paced compared to a lot of the content that you would find online. So I think that's one way that the internet in general is going to continue to change video storytelling.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We've got the goodie bag up here, and I promise not to hurl things at people, but if you are interested in getting a prize, just come up and say hi. Thanks again.
Thank you.